Hello and welcome back to another document deep dive. Now today, if you read about or hear about drones flying over Crimea, that sadly doesn't even raise an eyebrow, but what many people don't know is that the Germans actually tested out their own robot tanks or remote controlled tanks on Crimea during 1942, during the battle to capture Sevastopol, the capital down here, which was ringed by lots of heavy reinforced fortresses and heavy concrete installations. Um, so it was a pretty hard siege, and the Germans used these, at this time, very experimental, of course, remote controlled vehicles. The most famous of which is, of course, the Goliath. Now, the Goliath, which was originally actually a French design, has become somewhat of a staple in various World War II related video games, but information about its actual use and usefulness is fairly rare. Now, recently I looked into documents by the 72nd Infantry Division, and during their fight for Crimea, parts of the 300th Panzer Battalion were assigned to them, and this was a unit that tested various models of radio-controlled tanks, including the Goliath, but also some designs that are basically completely unknown and even I didn't know about before. So that was quite interesting. Let's look at these documents, starting with a diagram of their equipment and organization. Now, this document is from the 31st of May 1942, and it shows the first company of Panzer Battalion 300, which, as I said, was attached to 72nd Infantry. So there's a company troop here with a company leader in a Panzer III, and there were 3 signalers as well, and a Funkmeister, which incidentally was my nickname in college, and also a medical NCO here, and a leader for the company troop. Now, the first platoon was the one that used the heavy radio-controlled tanks. So what you can see here, the platoon leader was in a Panzer III, and then they had each group. Here is basically identical, had one Panzer III, and this one had the squad leader in it, and also the radio control equipment, and 4 Borgward IV ferngelenkt, so remote controlled tanks. So you can see those here. So every Panzer III had 4 of these Borgward IVs with them, and then they also had a truck here that basically had pioneers and all the troops that they needed for these tanks in it, right? And so this was the first platoon, 3 of these groups. To remind you, this is a Borgward IV next to the smaller Goliath. The Borgward IV did not intend to blow itself up, although it could be used like that for mine clearing, for example. But it was driven by a guy in it close to the operational area. And then that guy dismounted, it was turned to remote controlled and then controlled from a tank, in this case a Panzer III, towards the target, where it dropped off a demolition charge. That then it drove away, and then the demolition charge was remotely triggered. Right, well, that was the plan behind that. I have actually talked about this vehicle on this channel before when we looked at Panzer Lehr Division, which also had them. In their case, they were actually controlled from Tigers and King Tigers. But these early examples were controlled from Panzer IIIs. Now, down here we have the second platoon, which is only there for fire support, and because of that they don't have any of the remote controlled vehicles, and as you can see they had 4 Panzer IIIs and also 1 truck. And then here we have a third platoon where it gets interesting again. Again, there's a Panzer III for the platoon leader, and then each group has 1 Panzer III here. Now, they had 2 Kettenkrats, which were also remote controlled, which is something that I was not aware of. They did actually remote control these Kettenkrats, which you probably know from various games and movies. In case you don't know, this is a non-remote controlled Kettenkrat. I would like to see a picture of how they achieved remote control for that. They must have had some kind of device in order to interact with the steering wheel, I guess, in order to make these remote controlled. Now, in addition to the 2 Kettenkrats, each of the groups in a third platoon had a truck with a trailer, and on that they carried 8 Goliaths. With the exception, of course, of the third group here, which only had 3, possibly because they had been equipped with another Borgward IV, as you can see here, right? And the actual 19 Goliaths that they had were organized as follows. They had a leader of the Goliath platoon, and then you can see here there's 3 Goliaths in each kind of group, and each group has 1 Goliath driver, and they together, and 2 of them together are under the command of 1 collection ward or something like that. It's hard to translate. So there was 1 guy in charge of these 2 drivers, and they had these 3 vehicles here. Although there's actually problems associated with this organization, which we will talk about later, and also they have 1 in reserve. Lastly, there are some interesting technical details. So the Borgward IV had a demolition charge of 450 kilograms, and the range is, for the remote control equipment, is up to 1,000 meters. Now the Kettenkrad, as I said, this is completely new to me, apparently dropped off or had as a suicide charge on it the same 450 kilogram charge, and also the same remote control equipment. Now the Goliath had a 65 kilogram charge only and had only a 700 meter range. And it says down here that the Borgward IV and the Kettenkrad in this unit were radio controlled, and the Goliath was wire guided. So to me, actually, even though it's the most famous one, it seems to be the least useful, even just from the technical data. But let's look at some after-action critiques. Now, one thing is interesting here. The Kettenkrads are not actually mentioned in this, and apparently had not been used. However, they did use other vehicles that were not actually part of the diagram that we looked at. We will see you will see what I mean here. So, first of all, this is about the Borgward IV here. So, by June 1942, 36 B4s were deployed, of which the following were lost: 8 due to artillery fire, 2 due to vehicle damage, 2 were manually piloted while driving in front of their own infantry and hit mines. 1 was lost in connection with the explosion of an ammunition train. 20 of the B4s were deployed remotely. The following were lost during remote-controlled operations. So 1 due to a remote-controlled error, so apparently they guided it into a creek or whatever. 1 due to artillery fire. 1 fell into a shell crater. 7 drew out anti-tank fire. In all cases, the anti-tank guns were engaged by tanks and, as far as can be determined, destroyed. 3 were struck by mines and fulfilled their mine-detecting duties. 1 was used against tanks. The tank, according to the wounded pilot officer, a T-26, was destroyed. 1 got stuck in a shell crater 20 meters from an enemy bunker and was remotely detonated, after which no further firing was carried out from the bunker. 1 got stuck 80 meters from a bunker due to an anti-tank hit. The anti-tank gun was engaged and the Russians retreated in large numbers. 2 destroyed bunkers. 1 started to burn due to an artillery hit to its engines in front of an enemy infantry position. The Russians left the trench and were shelled by tanks. 4 were used on very deeply dug-in infantry positions that severely delayed the advance of their own infantry and were inaccessible to other weapons. In 1 case, the use of a special vehicle, that's what they call them, made it possible to capture a position that had previously withstood 3 infantry attacks. In all cases, the effect was very significant and helped the infantry advance. So, that was what they did with the Borgward IV. Now, the document carries on here. They also used Beutepanzer, so captured tanks. In fact, it says here, the following captured tanks were used, 29 all in all. And of these, 13 were destroyed through artillery fire, 9 were destroyed by vehicle damage, and 8 were remotely controlled. So apparently, they, in addition to the German vehicles, used some kind of captured vehicle, I think possibly from Dunkirk. You will see why I think that later. And these were outfitted with this remote-controlled equipment, which I had never heard before, to be honest. This is something you'd never really hear about. But apparently they converted several British tanks that they didn't need otherwise to remote control, which to me seems pretty hard, because I would imagine there would have to be a custom solution for each of these, right? So it seems quite a bit of quite a bit of effort to do that, but okay. So they remote controlled 8. What happened to them? Of these, one was destroyed at 200 meter by artillery fire. 2 ran into mines and thus created a gap. 1 was manually guided to within 40 meters of the anti-tank ditch, misguided by an infantry marshal. It detonated under the fire of our Nebelwerfers and, according to eyewitness accounts, was said to have had a significant impact. 3 were guided against the trench system and proved effective. The trench was leveled to a depth of about 20 meters, with a lethal effect of at least 100 meters around it. According to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel, more than 50 Russians lay dead in the trench, bleeding from the mouth and nose. And then it says here, 1 Bren destroyed an anti-tank bunker that had held up the advance of our infantry, of 2 infantry regiments for 2 days. The bunker, also according to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel, had supplied the entire surrounding trench system with ammunition. So this seems to me like they converted Bren or universal carriers for one thing, but sadly no other vehicles are mentioned, and as you can see in the diagram of the unit, they don't mention these captured vehicles in there at all, which is weird. So I wonder if these were all Brents, or if there were, like, I don't know, remote-controlled cruisers, remote-controlled Matildas. We just don't know, but they had something like that. It goes on here with the Goliath, 7 of which were destroyed by artillery fire. 1 was guided to within 20 meters of an enemy bunker and brought to a halt there by a concentrated charge, but it was still detonated remotely. Infantry fired on the hand grenade launchers. Shortly thereafter, the Russians detonated an electric minefield in front of the bunker. 2 were used against earth bunkers, crushing them and thus disabling them. It says here, demands for further development. Number 1, they first talk about the captured tanks, about the Beutepanzers. Captured tanks. The use of captured tanks in difficult terrain and over long distances usually results in complete vehicle failure. The remote control of captured vehicles must remain a secondary function of the guided weapon arm in the future, as originally intended. The equipping of captured tanks of all types with wire control must continue to be investigated and can be used successfully on a case-by-case basis, particularly in Africa. And this again indicates to me that these were British vehicles primarily. Number 2, the wirelessly guided explosive device must be armored all around to be SMKH proof and have armor protection for the driver's head, which protrudes from the vehicle. This eliminates, number 1, the possibility of being dropped by artillery sprinters, and number 2, allows the special driver to follow his tank much more easily under artillery fire. Minor technical requirements include faster arming and switching to remote control, the higher speed demanded by general staff, and the further technical development of remote control devices, which still require too much work from technically trained personnel before deployment. Number 3. The Goliath, in its current form, has not delivered what it originally promised. This is actually due to the fact that it requires 5 to 6 men to pull into the deployment position. This massed advance frequently suffered significant losses, which, combined with the very difficult terrain, sometimes prevented immediate follow-up behind the infantry. The Goliath's lack of the close-by disengagement positions mentioned in the cover letter had a particularly disadvantageous effect. The infantry's desire for such a vehicle is very strong and will be fulfilled if this vehicle becomes self-propelled with the aid of an engine and can be advanced by 1 man who can also lie down. The Goliath's speed must be increased to 12 to 15 km/h. Lastly, we will look to this cover letter, and I will only read this part because it kind of shows that the Germans had high hopes for this. Furthermore, it must be considered that, like all new weapons, the guided weapon arm carries its teething problems. To further consider these teething problems, a comparison with the attitude of the German Wehrmacht towards the British tank arm in 1915/16 is apt. So yeah, now personally, with the benefit of hindsight, I think that there was one key technology that they were missing, that they simply had no realistic possibility of developing, and that made this basically largely unusable, which is, and probably they didn't even conceive of this being a possibility, but I think what is missing here is the possibility of transmitting video, like a live video feed over radio waves. This is something that is never really mentioned here because this was so science fiction to them, but I would say that without that, these would always be cumbersome and kind of useless. Because if you use these in like video games, usually you deploy them and then you see where they're driving from their point of view. But this was just not possible. You would have to um, look where they were driving from your tank or from some position in the field where you had your remote control equipment. And even with binoculars, unless the terrain is flat like a billiard table and completely in your favor in terms of light conditions, you will never really be able to be as exact and to always keep an eye on your vehicle. It will always like disappear behind some ridge or whatever. So this basically made these more of a plaything than a useful technology. At least that's my opinion on the matter. Obviously, they didn't even conceive of this possibility because it was so science fiction, and this is why drones are used today in large numbers, whereas back then they were more of a special occasion kind of thing. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.